You might have heard of the term spiritual bypass, and in today's video, I'm going to talk about 3 ways that spiritual bypass might show up in your life and on your spiritual path. Hey everyone, I'm Sonja and this is Wholiness Connection. I hope you find a warm sense of welcome here. On this channel, I hope to support everyone in deep connection to yourself, to spirit in whatever way that's calling you, and to others. So you might have already heard of the term spiritual bypass, which generally means to do things or go more spiritual, what we consider more spiritual, but then in doing so, we're actually avoiding something else that's maybe more difficult. So that's just the really general definition. But I want to talk today about 3 ways this might actually look in your life, on your spiritual path, because I think it's really helpful to understand a bit more concretely how it might play out, so that we can be aware of it and watch out for it and hopefully not do it. Or notice when we're doing it. Sometimes we've slipped into it already, that we can notice that we're doing it, come to that awareness, and then that can help us to get out of it. So the first way that this can play out is in skipping over a particular kind of hard stuff, which is difficult emotions. And so I say difficult emotions, and they can be ones that we consider more negative, right? Like anger, for example. Those can be ones that we really want to skip over. Sometimes we might skip over something like sadness, but it could be that we have decided that certain emotions also aren't as acceptable. So something like anger might be more likely to be spiritually bypassed. So this can be a way of not feeling the emotion, right? Because it feels uncomfortable to feel a lot of certain kinds of emotions. And it can also be as a way of sidestepping some healing that we need to do, because the healing process can also be difficult and painful to go through, even though it's very important. So this, I think, can sometimes be the classic way that spiritual bypass is thought of, and people can be, critical of sort of like unicorn fairy dust or like positive thinking spirituality because of it. And I don't think they necessarily have to be separate from each other. I think that we can cultivate a positive mindset and do lots of that kind of work, and at the same time try not to exclude the natural human emotions that we have or that might be cropping up. So the important thing here is to try to recognize in particular emotions that you find unacceptable in order to realize that they also need to be welcomed, and then hopefully not to spiritually bypass them. And another thing that might help here is to really be in touch with your body, because our body often gives us those signals of discomfort, or, even if it's just momentary and we're up in our heads with positive thinking or with spiritual practices that are trying to override what is coming up for us, cueing into the body, it can be very helpful to try to pick up on even just those momentary signals of discomfort and to explore that further. And I just want to read to you the poem by Rumi that applies so well here, so I can't help but read it. It's one of my favorite poems, and you may have heard it already. It's called The Guest House, and this is a translation by Coleman Barks. This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still, treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. And so just to sum up here, one of the ways that we can spiritually bypass is bypassing emotions that are difficult or that we perceive as negative. And that can be a problem because, well, first of all, just because we need, as humans, we need to let those emotions flow through us. And then also it can sometimes be a way where we are inadvertently skipping a healing journey because of that, because of not going into the darker or more difficult places. So a second way that spiritual bypass can show up in our lives is not doing the actual work or practice of our spiritual path. And so this can look a lot of different ways, but I'll talk particularly today about sort of going through the eye of the needle of a particular practice or spiritual path. So this is where we can maybe get caught more up into insight rather than actually doing practices. And so insights can be wonderful things. Maybe they're even what got us on a particular spiritual path in the first place, or what give us beautiful insights into the religious path that we're on. But if we're being called to practice, let's say it's to meditate more, or it's to, read a Bible verse every day, whatever that is that we're called to, we want to make sure that those spiritual insights in that sense of having that kind of knowledge about it isn't like what we're going to instead of what we're being called to in terms of the actual practice. And this is very much about like making sure that if we're called to a particular path, that we go through the eye of the needle, as it were. So it means kind of really taking the path all the way if we're called to do that. And the caveat here is that, it's really about, if you have that knowing that that's what you're called to, like that that's what you're supposed to be doing or you want to be doing. You have that calling from spirit to do that. Can there ever be times in one's life where you have a spiritual awakening, or you're in ecstasy, or maybe you are just really enjoying presence? Absolutely. And so it could be that is something that's really calling to you instead, right? Or that's like your particular place on the spiritual path instead. But what I'm talking about here is when you're really wanting to do it, but you are letting yourself, think about spiritual insights instead of doing the actual practice, when your intention is to do the practice and that's what you're called to. And there can be, if it's something that requires developing a habit, like I said, for some of those things, meditation, trying to stick with it, starting up a habit of reading a particular scripture, there are ways to work with that, right? Can't necessarily assume that'll come immediately. So it's understandable that we might try to slip our mind away to doing something else. Look at how we do that in the rest of our lives, right? We very easily slip into scrolling on social media, for example. But if we understand that we are letting ourselves do that and sort of letting that take the place of the practice that we're trying to do, then hopefully we can use all kinds of tools, because there are tools out there, to develop the habit and to work with it and to actually do it. A third way that spiritual bypass can play out in our lives and in our spiritual paths is by avoiding, let's just call it the world, kind of the practical 3D things that we need to do or interactions we need to have. And that can include also our body. So if we're very up in our heads with our spiritual insights, or we're feeling very spiritually connected, we still don't want to forget our body. That's still very important and can be welcomed onto our spiritual path as very important. You might have a different spiritual way of thinking of this depending on your own path. Perhaps you think of yourself as a vessel, and so you want your vessel and connection point to spirit to be healthy, or you might think of it as a beautiful source of other information. Like I said in the very first point, that actually can be where you find out about your emotions and a way to move them. You can do body practices, right, on different spiritual paths as well. Whether that's lifting your arms up in a praise at a particular church service, whether that's doing yoga, there's lots of ways in which the body is part of the spiritual path. And then to go back to what I sort of mentioned right at the beginning there, before I got into the body, it can look like other aspects of interacting with the world as well. So maybe it's about avoiding a particular difficult interaction that you need to have with someone. Maybe you need to tell them a difficult truth, but in your head, you're just saying, well, I'm just going to forgive them already. And so you might not see where the spiritual bypass is not letting you grow, psychologically and interrelationally. And relationships and those kinds of interactions are actually like a beautiful, wonderful way that we can have huge growth. And it's not just psychological. Of course, I don't really think they're separate anyway, but it's not just psychological, but also spiritual. And the reason I kind of lumped the body in with relationships and other interactions in the world here under this sort of category of the world is because of a particular concept that I definitely heard growing up, which was this idea of being in the world and not of it. And I think different spiritual traditions have different forms of this, some maybe more than others, depending on the tradition. And I don't think that was an original concept that Jesus said anymore. Like those weren't those exact words that were used. I believe now that what was actually said was more akin to not of the world, but sent into it to be in love. And thanks to Aaron Chittister for that particular textual analysis. Of course, the original concept is true in a sense, right? If we think of it as being in a particular mindset, so not being of the world's mindset, necessarily accepting everything societally, value-wise or otherwise, right? That could be different from what our spiritual values are. So in that sense, it's absolutely true. But I don't think that means that we don't do actual practical interactions with people that actually can be part of the spiritual journey, or that we are to ignore the body. So how can we watch out for this or try to prevent it? So, I mentioned a couple things, trying to notice your body giving you clues. So there are some ways to do it, and just sort of being aware of this as a potential issue can be good. But I actually don't want to say just something like just go after the hard stuff, because I think that really what this is about is actually trying to listen. I call that obedience, because the word obedience has its roots in listening. And so it's much more about that than about just going after what's hard. Oh, I'm not spiritually bypassing because I'm going after what's hard. Well, that may or may not be the right thing. Because as I talked about in another video, sometimes we have spiritual perfectionism, and that can actually have blocks to our path. Or sometimes that striving mindset that we would be in, or that like going after it tough mindset, could pose a difficulty. And, it might not even be what we need in our particular path. Maybe what we need at a given time is softening, or letting ourselves being held and trusting. Or maybe it's even about not acting. And so if we were to get into the mindset of acting, that would be actually contrary to what it would be helpful to do on our spiritual path. So the overall advice that I would have is simply to cultivate this listening and this, which I call obedience, like I said, and that awareness of where spirit is calling to you in your particular path. And sometimes it can be helpful to talk with a soul friend or a spiritual advisor in order to help you sort of like understand what's working within you. But however you do that, the point is to really connect with where spirit is calling to you. And so then not trying to spiritually bypass it. On the other hand, if it is something that is softer and isn't as much about going after what's hard, trusting that as well. I hope you found this helpful. Let me know in the comments if you have had experiences of spiritual bypass, or you have particular other ways that you've noticed that it shows up.